Okay, welcome back. This is the episode today's with Dave Roberts, a really, really interesting guy. Been writing about energy for like 15, 20 years through different publications, probably most famously with Vox. However, now he's going solo and he's writing for the Volts newsletter. So Volts on Substack. You'll find links to it into the description if you're interested. But nonetheless, I found him because of an article he wrote about geothermal energy, something that has been extremely top of mind for me recently. You might have seen my own article in geothermal engineering on atlasgeographic.com. But nonetheless, I wanted to get him on to talk about that. Now, naturally, as it goes, he came on and it turns out he has about a billion other interests apart from just geothermal energy. So we did speak about more than that. In fact, I did edit this conversation a bit where I took a large chunk and actually put it at the end. And that's just because it didn't really fit into the sort of energy theme that I wanted to have this conversation about, where Dave essentially just gives his 10-15 sort of worldview projection into the future on what the US political scene might look like. So I put that at the end just because it might be interesting to some of you, but I just removed it from the middle because I didn't want it to sort of break up what the reason you might have come here for, which was to hear Dave talk about geothermal energy, but also energy more generally. He was an absolute pleasure to talk to, and I really hope that you enjoy this conversation with Dave. All right. Well, Mr. Roberts, David Roberts, thanks so much for giving me some of your time. How you going?
Happy to be here.
So I came across your work. It was one of the Vox articles, which was your former employer, or actually current employer, right? You still do sort of some stuff for them, but at least not your official employer.
Right.
Yeah. You wrote a piece about geothermal energy, and this is a real super exciting interest of mine, and so I thought I really, really want to absorb everything this man knows about geothermal. But before we get into that, I just want to, quickly allow you to give yourself a bit of a frame for sort of who you are, what you do, and where your authority comes from to speak about the energy revolution, or ditch revolution, but at least energy in general.
Sure. I have no good answer to the authority question. I mean, it's a long story, but the short version is around 2003 or 4, I had dropped out of the philosophy PhD program I was in and was bouncing around jobless and skillless and experienceless. And just really randomly got a job as a editorial assistant at a small web publication called Grist, which is an environmental publication. Mm-hmm. And so once I got in there, I was like, oh, I guess I better learn about environmental stuff and learn how to write and learn how to be a journalist. So I was actually at Grist for 10 years and just worked my way up from doing kind of scut work and, editing and stuff and fact checking and stuff up to writing full time, and just taught myself. I mean, I'm 100% self-taught on all this stuff. So I have no authority other than the authority that comes from reading lots of long PDFs over the course of 15 years. Sure. So that's what I've been doing. So I worked at Grist for 10 years and then went over to Vox for about 5 years. And now have started my own newsletter called Volts, which is about the same stuff, about this sort of intersection of clean energy and clean energy technology and politics, U.S. politics, sort of where all those things meet.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but in case I forget to say it, is it specifically US-centric politics, or do you ever look globally? Because the story of energy and everything around it is a real global issue. It's impossible to just think that one nation is going to cause this
change. I mostly stick to the U.S., although I fully acknowledge that when it comes to climate change and really the macro trends in clean energy, it's all about what happens in China, and the U.S. is kind of a footnote, and so all this is kind of pointless. But I'm an American and obsessed with U.S. politics.
Yeah, let's not be too nihilistic about it.
Regardless. Yeah, so mostly I stick to the U.S. I do occasionally cover the sort of international climate negotiations and those dynamics, but I don't get a lot into the specifics of other countries now.
Well, it seems like a really serendipitous opportunity with the grist company that you happen to, just take a job because you wanted a job, but it ended up being within the realm that you, I am assuming, are extremely passionate about. I mean, this is more than just an income, right? Like this is what really sort of gets you out of bed.
Well, it's funny, but no, it was not a pre-existing passion that drew me to the job. It was the needs of learning at the job that drew me to the thing. And so I'm a city guy. I'm not really a hike in the woods lover of nature type. Like I have nothing against nature, but but I like I like cities. I like civilization, but I really like systems and system thinking. That was what drew me to philosophy in the first place. And the cool thing about both climate change and clean energy is that they're just huge, like systems of systems, right? So there's lots of like emergent effects and different interactions, and it's very intellectually interesting.
Yeah.
In a way that I think like, oh, some bad corporation dumped something into a river, like it's bad, but it's not that interesting, right? Like there's nothing unexpected or, there's nothing to figure out about it. It's very plain what it is. But when it comes to climate change, it's a real challenge to know how to think about it and how all the parts fit together. So it's intellectually very rewarding, and that's kind of what's kept me at it.
Interesting. So the same reason you like philosophy is the same reason you like energy. I suppose that's a bridge that I'm not sure many people have considered.
There are more ex-philosophy majors sprinkled around the professions than you would think, especially journalism. There's a bunch of them in journalism. The skills you learn and the skills you learn in philosophy school are extremely applicable, both in just writing clearly, but also, like I said, in thinking clearly and in thinking about how systems interact and how to, it's the same habits of thought almost.
It's funny you say that. Very topical. There's a guy who writes a lot online called David Perel. You might be familiar with him or not. And he just today posted a very sort of viral Twitter thread about philosophy. It's kind of like a meme. Why would you do a philosophy degree? You can't get a job from that. But what philosophy does is it teaches you how to think. And someone who can think can communicate. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, communication is the ultimate skill if one wants to be employable. And so
yes, you can teach people how to do things, and you can teach people technical material, but it's very difficult to teach people how to think and write. I think those skills are, if anything, more valuable now than ever.
Well, that's an interesting place to start off then. So you dropped out of the master's degree in philosophy. So it mightn't have been all that you were hoping for, or was it just a financial reason you dropped out? I mean, talk to me a bit about the master's in philosophy.
That too is a long story, but I'll give the short version. I got actually a terminal master's, a master's at the University of Montana, and then was going to go on and also get a PhD. And it's a combination of things. One, coming really close, but not quite getting into the school I wanted to get into, which was very devastating at the time. And number two, so I went and started a PhD program somewhere else. And just two, the closer I got to academia, the closer I saw academia, the way it actually, the actual lived experience of being an academic philosopher.
Okay.
And I just was like, hell no. Yeah. I don't want anything to do with that. If nothing else, I want to choose where I live. Whereas if you're in one of these humanities PhD programs where there's like 100 PhDs for every job, you are scrabbling to get a job anywhere. Yeah, like you're like if there's a job in East Kansas, some like not even tenure track job in East Kansas, there'll be 20 Harvard and Yale grads fighting it out. And so
that's insane. And
I just wanted to choose where I live. And also like academic philosophy has become so arid and it's become so meta and it's kind of crawled up its own ass. Everybody's writing about what somebody else wrote about, what somebody else wrote about. So this kind of stuff that drew me to philosophy, the stuff I wanted to do was thinking systematically about the world and like real human problems and human societies. And so I actually am doing much more of that now in my current job than I would have been able to do, I think, in academic.
Yeah, that's not
philosophy.
surprising, right? I mean, I'm not very well versed in philosophy, but I imagine that there are very little sort of groundbreaking or really thought-provoking ideas coming out of an academic philosopher. I mean, the people that write really interesting philosophy are just people with other jobs. You know, like it's always a side
Yes.
hustle, isn't it?
Well, being an academic is all about being published. You have to publish papers. That's the only sort of metric, especially for something like philosophy. Like, how do you measure how good someone's philosophy is? So the only real metric
It's
is
the wrong question, is it?
publishing.
You don't want to be measuring like how good someone is at it.
You could argue whether philosophy is modern academia is not a very welcome home for philosophy
Yeah.
in generally. So just the ideas get smaller because you need a chunk you can carve off to make a paper out of. And so everybody's just cranking out papers about extremely small, finely honed chunks of things that just have no real connection left to lived experience or to people's lives. So yeah, I feel like I'm doing philosophy in the field in a way that's way more satisfying than I could have otherwise.
Yeah, the incentives are wrong from the academic perspective, right? Even outside of philosophy, but just more towards science generally. I mean, whatever your value is how many times your peer-reviewed article has been referenced, right? And then
At least in science, though, there's like some stuff in the world that you can point to. At least if like an experiment did something, you can point at it and say it did something. In philosophy, you're like, my idea was good, and someone else is like, no, it wasn't, and like,
there's a paper.
you know, who's going to decide who's right about that? So
Yeah.
there ends up just being a lot of all the metrics to judge people because there's so many people competing. Just end up being kind of artificial and make worky. I just didn't like the look of it at all.
I wasn't. Yeah, I didn't anticipate to go down this route, but you got close to the academic philosophy, career, lifestyle, etc. To have gotten close to it suggests that you yourself are very interested in philosophy. So, what is your philosophy? Now, it might be a very bad question to ask, but I want to keep it open-ended so you can work with it however it works.
Wow. You're asking me a lot of big, complicated questions. I would say, I mean, I don't know how familiar you or anybody else is with academic philosophy, but I was into
Don't assume a lot.
a kind of combination of cognitive science, which is thinking about how people think and what consciousness is and what thinking is, and then the American pragmatists. That's like Dewey, James, those fellows, and Richard Rorty later on. But Richard Rorty sort of famously took the premises of American pragmatism and followed them, and basically they led him out of philosophy. They sort of led him to believe that the sort of preoccupations and questions that philosophy was asking were sort of misguided, and that if you want to, basically they led him into practice. They led him out of philosophy and into engagement. He became a little bit more of like a political commentator towards the end of his life. He started writing more about democracy and pluralism and how to live together. And I think sort of the way of summarizing it is it ends up being all about pluralism, which is, it doesn't really matter in the end which ideas are right, because even if you have the right ideas, you're still living in a world filled with people who disagree with you, right? If you want to live and you want
practical
to live in a free world, then all the real practical problems are not about determining who's right and who's wrong, but just determining how to live together with people you disagree with, right? How to make pluralism work. and that's not ultimately going to be a philosophical idea. That's just going to be a bunch of very sort of practical pedestrian questions about procedure and law and sort of the arrangement of how to legislate and, things like that. Just very sort of, it's all very workmanlike, but like those are the real questions. Those are the questions that matter for how people live. So that's kind of like philosophy led me more into politics and practical kind of and like psychology and things that have a little bit more empirical grounding. So, I mean, I'm philosophically a pragmatist, I would say, of some version.
And does that
And
is that manifested
it,
in the real world as just you being like a realist? Very objective.
well, realism has a very, very distinct, specific meaning in philosophy.
Okay.
This and pragmatism too. Like pragmatism means one thing in the vernacular and a little slightly different thing in philosophy. So basically, if I was summing it down, I would just say this: it's the idea you're just sort of abandoning this idea that you can ever find or even really need absolute truths or final truths or a grounding for anything or a foundation for anything. It just accepts we're all limited, stuck here together. We're all figuring what's real is what we all basically agree is real, and what is true is what works. and it's a much more turn kind of away from metaphysics and sort of the kind of a lot of the pud pulling self-absorbed stuff in philosophy, and just much more about the practicalities of how to live together. And so that segues right into politics, into basically like liberalism. Everybody has something different in mind by liberalism, but I would say I'm on the left. I'm a liberal, generally cosmopolitan in thinking, generally thinking that I would like for everybody to be free and to live together in peace. It turns out that's really
like
hard.
a nice idea.
That's more than enough to keep you occupied.
So am I wrong in assuming then that the way that worldview then affects the way that you look at climate change is, and correct me if I'm wrong in this assumption, but rather than looking at climate change and saying, wow, this is a huge existential problem and it's the right thing to do because we got to treat our environment well, rather than approaching climate change from that angle, you're approaching it from the angle that it's just good business and it's good practice to actually use these other types of energies because, hey, look at the trade-off here. This actually is better in the long term.
Well, the thing about climate change is it's not good for anyone. So it almost doesn't matter whose interests or what perspective you take on it. There's no perspective from which it's good, right? Like if you care about biodiversity, if you just care about, if you're just sort of purely human centric, which I think a lot of people are, like I care about humanity, and like I don't care that much about other species. Even from that perspective, climate change is really bad. It's going to hurt humanity. Even if you are just a nationalist and you only care about your country, you don't even care about the rest of humanity. There is no country for which climate change is going to be good in the long term. So, the pragmatism is just, it's a practical problem. The thing I think I shy away from is people who are inclined to say that climate change represents some deep existential flaw in our consciousness, and only by a revolution in consciousness can we change things. Like
if we
I'm just
love the
impatient
earth
with that
more.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm just impatient with that, because what I've seen most of all in politics, from following it really closely for 15 years, is that it is really, really, really hard to do anything, to get anything done, to get anything good done, to make anything good happen at all. All I've done in politics for 15 years is dial back my expectations. And now I'm just like, just a nudge in the right direction
Is a massive win.
is worth more than all the talk and theories in the world, right? Because there's a lot of forces arrayed against positive change. So just making anything good happen on any level is, I've sort of been reduced to that.
I did ask the question on the 10 to 20 year worldview more from the perspective of climate change and energy. What technologies and innovations do you see that are going to sort of win out here? Because I sort of think that as much government intervention as you can make, whether it's a carbon tax or whether it's huge innovation into certain green techs and and taxes and levies against the fossil fuels, it's still going to come from some innovation of a unit of energy that costs less than oil but gives you the same amount of output. That's going to actually be the catalyst that shifts the world towards a more greener future or not. So with all of that preamble, what do you think about the energies, and maybe any comments on what I said as well?
Well, first, I would just really strongly caution against viewing government policy and technological innovation as separate categories, as distinct categories where one might save us and the other might not, or vice versa. There is, and again, I'm most familiar with the history of the U.S., but I feel fairly confident it's the same everywhere. There is no technological innovation in the history of the U.S. that you can find that does not have roots in public policy and public support, publicly funded innovation and research, public policies that push research forward, public policies that pull nascent technologies into the market. So innovation and public policy are very much of a piece. Technological innovation can be dialed up and down by government policy, done well or poorly. So I would not want to pull those apart. I do think ultimately the name of the game is making clean technology the sort of cheap, default, obvious choice. But there's a lot more involved in that than the technology itself. I mean, if the technology itself were determinative, already, I think, in most of the U.S., it's cheaper to build a new solar power plant with storage than it is to continue running existing, already built coal plants. Like those coal plants are just sitting there losing money hand over fist. And the utilities could save money if they tore them down and replaced them with renewable energy. So already the economics, and they've won.
What's happening
but there's still a bunch of coal plants.
Are the coal plants still subsidized by the United States? Is that why they're not being turned down?
It's partly subsidies. It's partly just the incredibly stupid and complicated way that we run utilities, the sort of utility regulatory regime, the way utilities are set up, is very complicated, but very has a bunch of negative incentives in it. Let's just say they were built to expand the fossil fuel grid, basically. Like that's what all their incentives point to, and so. Now technology is different, the needs are different, the environmental needs are different, everything's different, but they still got all these old incentives. So a lot of it is just about reforming utilities, and so that's kind of my point. So like innovation has done its part on solar and wind, but like they're not victorious yet because you need public policy to go along with that. You need public policy to, even if they're cheaper, they don't automatically replace the stuff they're more expensive than, right? You still need a push. You still need public policy. So, but on the technology front, I guess what I would say is that solar and wind and batteries, like the fastest, cheapest way to reduce emissions quickly in the short term is clean electrification, which means cleaning up the electricity grid by replacing fossil fuel plants with renewables and electrifying other sectors. So like moving transportation off of internal combustion onto electricity, moving home heating and cooling off of natural gas onto electricity. And then that's sort of your pathway to fast, bulk, immediate emission reductions. You're not going to be able to get all the way there with wind and solar and batteries because wind and solar are famously variable. They leave gaps. Batteries are not going to be cheap enough or of sufficient scale to fill in all those gaps. So you need other things. You're going to need clean hydrogen, I think, in some form to help with industry and stuff like that. You're going to need some sort of liquid fuel for planes and big ships. Maybe that will be some form of biofuel. Maybe it will be some form of hydrogen-derived fuel. It would be helpful to have some firm low carbon options, which means zero carbon options that you can turn on and off at will, unlike wind and solar. So things like small scale nuclear or geothermal plays that role of firm generation. And then of course there's like natural gas or biomass power plants with carbon capture and sequestration attached is another firm option. So I guess the shortest possible way to answer that question is wind, solar, and batteries do the bulk of the work, the fastest, biggest part of the work. And then there's a bunch of holes to fill in from there,
Yeah.
which will involve a bunch of different kinds of technologies and a bunch of different kinds of reforms.
Unless the big bad geothermal comes in and solves the problem for everyone.
Well, there's sort of the broad question is how much firm, clean generation do you need, right? And that's an open question right now. Depending, there's lots of modeling going on about this. And then the sort of second question is, of that clean, firm generation, what's that going to look like? What's going to play that role? Geothermal could potentially, with like some if innovations come through, if it gets cheaper, could play a big chunk of that role. And that would be, I think, for a lot of kind of climate heads, for a lot of sort of climate hawks, would be the ideal. That's as good as firm, clean generation gets, because the other firm, clean options are fossil fuels with CCS, which is like, nobody really wants it. It's certainly not clean. The green people don't really want a lot of that, or negative emissions technologies burying a bunch of carbon to compensate for the carbon you emitted, which. Greens don't really like that either. Really, of all the sort of clean, firm options, geothermal is by far the one that best fits with the priors of kind of the clean green crew. So I'm a big fan and a big booster, and I hope it comes through. But if I had to guess, I would say you're going to need lots of clean, firm options, and geothermal will be one of them. Okay. Small nukes will be one. There will be some CCS out there. It'll be a
Tell me what you think about this. I want to, because obviously the whole reason I reached out to you in the first place was geothermal, and I want to explain to you my understanding of the potential and promise of geothermal, and then have you either critique it or agree with it. Okay?
Sure.
So, as I understand it, the world is, the planet Earth is essentially a nuclear reactor. We have functionally infinite heat coming from the core of the world. I say functionally because it's got maybe a billion-year lifespan or whatever. We're not going to be here in a billion years. So functionally infinite heat coming from the core of the Earth, and then the soil, the crust that we live on is like a thin like film that would be on top of, say, a hot glass of milk. Essentially, it's that thin and fragile in the context of the entire planet. And so, therefore, we have this heat coming from the center up into the surface, and just say 15, 20, 30 kilometers below our feet, there are pockets around the Earth that have extremely hot quartz between 200, 300 Celsius, más o menos. And so, therefore, if you have the heat from the center of the Earth heating up these rocks, theoretically, all you'd want to do is capture some of that energy and then bring it to the surface. And how would we do that? We dig deep enough into this extremely hot quartz. That requires a engineering innovation that we currently, actually I figured out the other day, I think we might have, so we'll talk about that as well. But just for the sake of it, we don't have, which is a drill that can sustain the heat and drill into a rock this bad. Frack it, throw some water into it. The steam that comes up is then captured in a turbine, and there you go. We've created electricity that is functionally green, perfectly green. There's obviously going to be second, third, and fourth order effects that we can't predict, but nonetheless, just for the sake of it, functionally green and functionally infinite, which means if it's done at a big enough scale, the promise of geothermal energy in places like north of Cooper Pedy in Australia, Iceland, pockets of Sweden, a massive rock here in Mexico, it could potentially solve the energy problem. The one thing that we have working against us is this innovation of engineering. And that's how I understand geothermal. Now, I take it with a pinch of salt when someone says, here's the solution. But that's how I see things. What do you reckon?
I would just make a few amendments, because there's actually three different kinds of geothermal. Traditional geothermal works with these sort of natural geothermal fields where there's a natural sort of feature, a dome of hard rock that traps a pocket of basically superheated water. And that's what traditional geothermal has been. That's what most geothermal
That's like
power
hot springs that we have around the world, natural hot springs.
is today. Yeah, they're in those areas, but those are geographically confined. There's only a limited number of kind of those areas in the world, hydrothermal areas where the sort of heat and water are getting trapped in very convenient pockets. So that's one kind. The promise for advanced geothermal is the rock itself down deep enough is hot. So the idea is you can take hydraulic fracturing, which was developed for fracking natural gas, go down into just that very, very, very deep. This is all much deeper, right? Because everything, you get down deep enough, everything's hot, right?
How deep?
So you get down deep enough.
How deep?
Oh, I couldn't tell you without looking up the.
But am I in the 15, 30 kilometer range?
Yes, like miles. And this is why you need these special drill bits, and because things get because oil and gas has perfected a lot about drilling, but they don't really need to go into these hot areas. So oil and gas has never really perfected the technique of drilling in super, super hot rock. So that's what a lot of the innovation is going on. But you go down into that super, super hot rock, you jam water down there and fracture the rocks. You just create these cracks in the rocks, and then the water superheats and you pump it back up. So the beauty of advanced geothermal is you're not geographically limited, right? You can do that anywhere in the world. And if you can get down deep enough where it's super, super hot, you can make really cheap electricity out of it. Like the hotter it gets, the cheaper the electricity will be. So, but I would caution a little bit against the idea that it's infinite. I think you can tap out local, like you're not going to extinguish the Earth's core, obviously, but you can tap out local heat in a geographic area. So I don't think it's like there are reasons to think it's not.
Can you?
It's not infinite. It could play a big role.
On that point a bit. Why would it tap out?
Just because I think you drain enough heat out of the rock. You drain it faster than it's being restored, basically. Okay. Yeah. So you just have to moderate how much you take out. But the third form of geothermal, which is actually the oldest, centuries and centuries old, is instead of using the heat to boil water and make steam and turn a turbine and make electricity, you just use the heat directly to heat your house or your village or whatever. And I think like the oldest, what do they say? The oldest community geothermal system was built in, I think, the 1700s or something. So like this is something people have been doing for a long time. They realize we need heat in our homes. So it's much warmer 20, 30 feet down. So let's just go get some of that warmth. Yep. And the beauty of that, these are called ground source heat pumps. And the beauty of that is you're not creating the heat. You're just harvesting it. You're just going down and harvesting it and bringing it back up. So it's super, super, super efficient once you've got it built. But it is on an upfront capital cost basis. It's much more expensive than other options up front. This is like so many, this, by the way, just as an aside, is a feature of so many clean technologies. Over their lifetime, they're already cheaper, but they have much higher upfront capital costs. So a huge piece of clean energy innovation is finance innovation, is figuring out a way to finance these things, new tools to finance these things. The same way we sort of dreamed up the 30-year fixed mortgage for homes and unlocked home ownership for millions of Americans. We need to create new financial instruments like that to help fund some of these things that are expensive up front but cheap in the long term. So geothermal electricity and geothermal heat, and then of the electricity, there's the geographically confined, tapping into existing geothermal features, and then there's geothermal anywhere, which is super, super deep. And that's where the sort of super sexy, cutting edge innovation is happening right now, is figuring out how to get super, super deep. Just stuff like, how do you get a drill bit that won't melt? How do you get like tubes and, and electronic components that won't melt in that heat? It's all new. So there's a lot of interesting work going on there. I don't know if you saw recently, Google signed a deal with a cutting edge geothermal company called Fervo.
No, I didn't see that.
Because Google is trying not just to buy as much clean energy as the energy they use, which is the sort of standard way of saying you're zero emissions. Google is actually trying to match the clean energy to its usage in real time, so that it's literally using clean electrons throughout the day, which is a way more complicated and difficult task. So it's been, it's got its Google X or whatever its innovation arm is, looking around now for all these energy options, and it just signed a big deal with a geothermal company. And so geothermal has kind of lagged in the last until about 5 years ago, and then there's just been a boom, an absolute boom. It's super exciting to be following right now.
Super exciting.
And part of the boom, while I think of it before I forget it, and one of the interesting things about the boom, one of the reasons this has drawn so much interest and intrigue is that oil and gas is going through a rough period. You might have noticed. And if we get our shit together to reduce emissions the way we need to, is going to go through a much rougher period. And so you're going to have all these highly trained, super smart engineers out of work. And it turns out that what they're good at is drilling. So like, here is a way for oil and gas people who want to like spend their lives doing something better to put their exact skills to work in cutting edge zero carbon energy, which is really cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. In Stockholm, the geothermal heat just from the shallow grounds, it's where I live, Stockholm. I didn't realize, but my building was heated by this, right? And
yeah, it's very big. It's very big in Europe and especially in some like northern European cities. And the coolest thing you can do is build one giant well, geothermal well, to tap the heat, and then just run tubing throughout your city. Like it's like any other sort of city infrastructure, like sewer pipes or electrical lines or whatever. You just lay down geothermal piping, and you can heat your entire city from this one well. And if you can do that, it is by far the cheapest way to heat a city. Like by head and shoulders. It's just, again,
it's the upfront
super
cost.
Expensive upfront.
Which is why there's a suburb in Stockholm called Danderyd, which is the rich man suburb, and basically all the houses there have their own geothermal heating. And I saw it. It was very cool, especially once the architects get involved. You can make it beautiful, like it almost feels like your house is a part of the earth. But
yes, and it's steady heat, and it's comfortable too. It's a good, comfortable heat. I mean, it's just a matter of finding social organizations, whether it's city governments or whatever, that can think ahead and plan somewhat comprehensively, which is not, we're not great at that in the US either, but like
politicians around the world
you need to do this. You need to do this. I mean, at the very least, at the very baseline minimum, we need to be doing this for all new developments, all new neighborhoods, all new cities or developments need to be geothermally heated. That should be law. Because once you do it, it's like anything else. Once you do it enough times, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Like, we just haven't had the scale for this to really bring down costs the way they could. So, somebody just needs to sort of bite the bullet and pay those upfront costs to start that down the cost curve.
Yeah. Can you speak, you mentioned this company Fervo. Could you speak a little bit more about exciting companies in this space that you see and exciting innovations?
Well, a couple of different technologies are interesting. One is, so right now the standard is to pump the water down into the rock, fracture the rock, and then try to gather the water back up and bring it back up. There is a company that I can't remember its name off the top of my head, and I don't want to get it wrong while I'm talking to you. But there's a company that's doing what's called closed loop. So the idea is you just have like a fancy version of PVC pipe that goes all the way down, then laterally through the rock, and then all the way back up. So no water is ever released into, to get contaminated or to pick up chemicals or to anything else. There's zero sort of interaction between the geothermal well and the ground. It just heats the water and brings it back up. So you end up with superheated water without any of the dangers of contamination or anything else. That company is getting tons of hype and tons of investment, even though I can't remember the name now. I'm gonna find it for you though.
So the PVC pipe goes into the well, runs across, and then runs back up, and they just pour water in here, and it comes out as gas here. Then the water's recaptured, and it goes back in. That cycle.
Yes, it's called Eavor, EAVOR. It's actually a Canadian company. It's
EAVOR.
EAVOR. Because right now, all ground source heat pumps, there's the sort of small, like residential sized, those are all closed loop, right? The idea is just blowing that out into a truly massive, going down thousands of meters and across thousands of meters, making that work. And part of what's, I mentioned this before, but part of what's enabling a lot of this is natural gas technology innovations. Fracturing of solid rock comes out of the natural gas world, and lateral drilling was a huge piece of what enabled the fracking revolution. And that is also coming in extremely handy. So Eavor, sinks a pipe down and then lateral drills 2,000 meters across and then brings the pipe back up.
Oh, wow.
So for that whole, 2,000 meters, the water is just picking up heat. So it's going to be interesting in retrospect to see how much of this flows out of fossil fuel innovations. But there are a ton of there's a ton of companies that haven't even kind of reached have reached demonstration, but don't even have a commercial plant open yet. Like there's tons of, especially lately, there's tons of early stage
exploratory companies and stuff.
Just exploring, doing like lab work and engineering testing, and it's a really fun. Like if you're an engineering minded person, this is super fun. Area to be in right now.
Are you familiar with Robert Friedland and iPulse?
No.
It'd be interesting for you. He's a Canadian billionaire, made his money in copper mostly. He has the largest copper mine in the world. But this company, iPulse, are a drill tech company, and they're looking to tap this Mexican quartz that I mentioned earlier.
Well, yeah, interesting new ways of drilling are a huge piece of this. You think you just need a super hard drill head, but there are people using pulses of sound waves. Maybe that might be what you're referring to. There are people using lasers, drilling with lasers. Like it's much easier if you can figure out a way to do it that doesn't require a physical, thing jamming up against the rock. Like you're going to last a lot longer. Yep. So there's lots of stuff like that going on. The two other companies I meant to mention are Greenfire Energy as a startup, and Sage Geosystems. Both of those are kind of early startup, cutting edge. Overwhelmingly likely that most of these early companies will fail. It's just there's gonna be one that doesn't eventually.
That's exactly right. But all you need is the one to stumble across the right tech. They can patent it, make trillions of dollars, but as long as the rest of us can reproduce it, that's all that matters.
Yeah, and not just the right tech again, but like the right financing, like the right public policy, like all the pieces have to
Sure.
come together. Like this is what's been going on in geothermal, is like the pieces haven't been quite lining up, but now we have like the need, the policy, the engineers, it's all, I think it's all.
You know
coming
where it's going to
together.
come from, man? I think it's going to come. I think it's going to come from Sweden, and I think I'm going to be the one to pioneer it. I hope, and it will be through some Icelandic tech. So, who knows? Maybe this big innovation mightn't be US centric. It could come from Northern Europe. That
Well, they certainly know their
Oh yeah.
geothermal.
What I said to you
there.
earlier about that drill was I saw recently a company drilled into the heart of a volcano. So hundreds and hundreds of Celsius through molten lava, and the drill bit survived. So they're just testing how hot can we drill, and
Well, they're lucky in Iceland because they have the right geography, right? I mean, they have the natural heat just under the surface across that country.
for hundreds of years
We need something geography
geothermal's been a huge energy
independent
source
in
for
the
them.
U.S. Yeah, I think Greenfire is also super deep. One of those attempting to go super deep.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Alta Rock. That's the one that uses the lasers.
AULTA or ULT?
ALTAROCK.
Okay, let me finish off with two baseline questions that I ask everyone. What country are you most bullish on looking into the future?
Oh, I feel like this.
I think we established it's not America,
is, yeah, I feel like this is a cliche, but I'd probably have to go with one of your Northern European, social democracy. Like they kind of seem like they've got it figured out there. One of your Swedens or Norways or Finland. Oh God, I got to pick one. Finland. I was gonna pick one.
That's good. That's actually a good choice. It's a much better choice.
Sure, they're really interestingly placed energy wise too. Like they're starting to build now giant electrical transmission lines between kind of these, between the UK and some of these Northern European countries to start spreading. This is a huge piece of the clean energy puzzle, not to get off on a side thing, but a huge piece of the clean energy puzzle is not just where can you generate energy, but how can you share it over a wider area? Because the wider an area you hook up with transmission, the more likely that somewhere inside that area there's renewable energy available.
Okay, so Finland as the bullish country.
Finland. I'm gonna chew over that all night now. I'm probably gonna get back in touch. Change my
Nice
answer
one.
later.
And finally, Dave, a very closed question, but if you could witness a conversation between any two people of history that are alive, who would they be?
Oh wow. Wow. That's a tough one. Should have warned me in advance on this one. I confess that I would love to see the philosopher Daniel Dennett chat with probably like Rorty and Dennett. I don't think Rorty and Dennett actually got to spend any time together, but they're two of the most fascinating minds in philosophy, and they were on very similar tracks and have taken some very different turns over the years. And just watching those two guys hash it out would be nerd heaven.
Oh, that's cool.
That's such a nerdy answer.
Is Daniel Dennett the atheist, one of the four horsemen atheist? Is that the Daniel Dennett you're referring?
Yeah, I think I think that's what he's now. I think that's kind of what he's now famous and become associated with. He tried to rename them some awful thing. Brights. Yes, he was the one that tried to. He's like, atheist is a bad label. Let's rename them Brights, and everybody in the world was like,
just stay away from marketing, Daniel.
That's 1,000 times worse. Quit, get out of branding. Everybody thinks they're good at branding. Nobody's really good at it. No, but his earlier philosophical work is he has a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, which completely blew my young mind. So I would just love to. I mean, he's still alive.
He's still alive. Yeah.
Call him up and talk to him. Maybe I will.
You've got a podcast, right? Reach out to him.
Yeah, yeah. And it's remarkable who will say yes when you write them and ask them to podcast. So
Case in
I'll
point.
have that conversation.
All right, then.
Who are your two people? I'm curious. Surely you have an answer to this question now, having asked it so many times.
Say that again.
Who are your two people?
My two people. I've actually never had it turned around on me. And I actually know,
Pretty hard,
I have
isn't
an
it?
answer because I've thought about it. But I had this. My answer has changed since. But my answer at the time would have been Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche, because Jung came just after Nietzsche, and they come to very similar conclusions. However, Jung is firmly of the belief that the Bible tells the true story, whereas Nietzsche plainly is not. And so that conflict would have been very worthwhile, the ticket of admission. But like I said, that was just because I was super into Jung a couple of months ago, and I thought it was the most fascinating thing in the world. But I've kind of gotten over it. I think actually just Christopher Hitchens alongside anybody else, that has to be maybe Christopher Hitchens and Winston Churchill. I don't know. They just talk about like old school politics. Who knows? Christopher Hitchens and someone else is a conversation that, I mean, if the man was alive today, he would be the most billed podcast guest universally.
Oh my
Without a doubt.
God. I would get him on my podcast just to yell at him. I bet a lot of people would. That's probably like half his bookings would just be people wanting to yell at him. I should say
You
also,
don't like
it's
him
kind of sad that we're.
because of his stance on World War II. The invasion of the Middle East.
Yes. I think not only did he go horribly off the rails there, but I think he went off the rails in a way that casts a darker light on everything that came before. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where you're like, oh, maybe some of that stuff I was cheering you on about before, like, takes on a different cast now. I do want to say, it's sad that we're two dudes trading dudes that we want to hear talk. Uh, a really healthy field right now of philosophical pragmatism and feminism kind of overlapping, sort of like a feminist lens on pragmatism. And I don't know that field well enough to pick one of the women doing it for special attention. But there's so much interesting coming out of that, and there's so many interesting ideas. So if I had more time to choose, I would find someone from that field and have her talk with like a Richard Rorty, who I think, like many older male philosophers, had blind spots that he was not aware of because he had no female colleagues because of all the misogyny in the field. I mean, it's terrible in philosophy. It's terrible everywhere. It's terrible in philosophy. But I would love to see that, like a new angle on pragmatism that shows some of the blind spots of the older pragmatists hashed out with one of the older pragmatists.
Cool. Yeah, for sure.
That's an even nerdier answer if that's possible.
More that we can do to engage the other half of the population is just net benefit for all.
Yeah. All right.
All right, Dave.
I got to go,
Well,
I'm afraid.
yeah, again, I really appreciate it, mate. And, as things evolve down the line, maybe you want to come back on again.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime.
All right, mate. Take it easy. Cheers. And this is Dave's answer to the political 10 to 15 year worldview looking forward, which I took from earlier in the conversation. So here it is. Okay. Well, I think there could be a lot more said about the cross-section of your philosophy and your approach to climate change. So I actually do want to ask it. Just I'm always conscious of the time, right? Because there is obviously the meat that I want to get to, but naturally get drawn down a tangent that ends up taking up most of the time anyway. But instead, I want to move on actually into energy. Okay, so I'll start with the big one because then we can dial down from there. But obviously, 15 years you've been involved, looking, consuming a lot of information, writing about it, and trying to understand both the economics of it, but then also the politics of it, and then the science of it as well. And this is the climate crisis that I'm speaking of. How do you estimate right now the next 10 to 20 years is going to span out? And this isn't you being optimistic or pessimistic. It's you being a pragmatist. How do you think things are going to go?
You know, it's funny you should ask that. I would have had much more confident answers 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But if there's one thing the last 5 years have really driven home, it's that I don't have any idea what's going to happen, and, and things can lurch in very different directions than you think. We're not as stable here in the U.S. as we think we are, and our momentum, I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, although I might not have put it quite this way, I think I more or less bought into the Barack Obama philosophy, which is basically the arc of history idea, right? Like America has these shining great goals and ideals. It has always fallen short of them. And the whole project of America is working incrementally towards realizing those goals and making them real. And we're making progress, and that is the overall direction of history. There's something inevitable about it, right? I no longer think that at all. As a matter of fact, if you ask me just about the U.S., what the next 10 years are going to look like, I just say I don't know. The future has never been more opaque to me, and I think that's probably true to everyone. If you just consider the amount of giant confounding variables, there's climate change itself, there's the global, and I think it's safe to say it's global now, sort of backlash against democracy, more or less by nationalists, mostly white nationalists. How's that going to turn out? There's the quirks of the U.S. itself, demography and sort of economic growth. It's all incredibly opaque to me. So I have no idea how the next 10 years are going to go. I'm currently pretty pessimistic. It looks to me like the U.S. is basically sleepwalking into something like illiberal minority rule right now. The Republican Party, the conservative movement in the U.S., has more or less openly now abandoned its commitment to democracy and is much more committed to the ongoing cultural dominance of conservative white Christians. So, and they are currently engineering, the U.S. system is already biased in their favor in a million different ways. The Electoral College, the overrepresentation of rural areas in the Senate, all the voting rights, all the voting suppression laws that Republicans are passing at the state level now, on and on and on. They are already receive representation in government that is disproportionate to their numbers, and they're trying to just make that worse. Basically, they're trying to rig things so that they can rule the country despite having a minority of voters, right? Biden got 7 million more votes than Trump and barely won. And Democratic senators in aggregate got way, way, way more votes than Republican senators, but ended up with a 50-50 Senate. So the House and the Senate and the presidency are all structurally skewed against Democrats. And that's getting worse. Republicans are making it worse on purpose. The only real hope is for Biden and the Democrats, who right now have a very brief 2-year period where they're running everything. They've got both houses of Congress and the presidency. They've got a very brief window to pass some substantial voting reform, voting rights reform to forestall this. And it just looks like they're not going to be able to get their shit together, as is extremely familiar for anyone who's been following the Democratic Party for the last few decades. They're not going to be able to get their shit together. And so they're almost certainly going to lose the House in 2022, maybe the Senate too, then maybe the presidency. And then, you got voter suppression laws that they're passing at the state level will get passed at the federal level. The only reason the 2020 election was not stolen for Donald Trump is that there were a few key Republican state office holders who had integrity, who refused to skew the vote for Donald Trump. Like the guy in Georgia, Raffensperger, Trump was literally on the phone with him saying, I need a few thousand votes. And the guy refused to do it. He's been booted. All the Republican state officials who stood up against this attempt this time around are getting booted. Loyalists are getting put in those positions. They're changing laws such that Republican state legislatures, even if Democrats get a majority of votes in their states, can just choose to send Republican representatives instead. So, I mean, they're very explicitly and obviously setting up a way for a minority to rule the country. And if they do that, you know, like we've seen this story play out before, you know, you look at Turkey or, I mean, pick your country where democracy kind of crumbled in the face of reactionary backlash. It's always the same story. And once it happens, once the reactionaries get a firm grip on power, it is, you know, it's a decade. It's people in the streets. It's convulsion before you get out of that or past that. And so we are heading right into that. As far as I can tell, in the U.S., we are heading into that period. So I think it's at least entirely possible, if not probable, that the next decade for the U.S. will be almost total political paralysis, violence, maybe extrajudicial violence, political violence in the streets, law enforcement crackdowns on protests and political opponents, you know, just all sorts of ugly stuff that you see all in other parts of the world coming to the U.S. alongside almost total governmental paralysis on the problems that matter. I mean, I think you can look now. There are a set of states that in 2018 or 2020, Republicans took complete control over, right? Both houses of the state legislature and the governor. And there are states where Democrats got what's called a trifecta, both houses and the governor. And you can just look now. We have a record now, like what Republicans do when they get power versus what Democrats do when they get power. If you look at Democratic states that have gotten a trifecta, Washington, Colorado, they're passing climate laws, clean energy laws, police reform, voting reform. You know, they're trying to make people's lives better the way other democracies do. And if you look at what Republicans have done, where they've gotten power, more guns, less abortion, crackdown on protest, laws that do things like basically legalize running over protesters who are standing in the street, like in Florida, you know, stuff like that. Just culture war politics. That's what they do when they get in charge. And if they get in charge of the federal government, we're going to have, you know, it's going to be a long time before Democrats get back in power because all the structural disadvantages that they're facing are just going to get worse and worse and worse. I mean, even right now, Democrats have to have historic, unprecedented turnout just to win anything, right? They had to get 7 million more votes for Biden, and Biden barely squeaked in. So that hill that they have to climb is just getting steeper and steeper and steeper. So it would be very easy to tell a very apocalyptic story about the next decade in the United States. I kind of think like that's where the odds are right now, is some really ugly stuff happening. I mean, maybe one never knows, you know, you can't predict the future. So maybe something else will come along and skew it the other way. Maybe something else will come along and galvanize people into fighting this, you know, but we're sliding in a bad direction at a time when, as everyone around the world more or less agrees now, and the IPCC has said a gajillion times, this is the decade, right? The 2020 to 2030 is really the last decade where we have any chance of getting a hold of climate change such that we avoid catastrophic damages. This is really last chance time. And if the U.S. spends that decade fucking around with autocracy, it's just going to be bad for the world. It's going to be bad for the U.S. It's going to be bad for the world. That's all very pessimistic and downer, but that's sort of like what I'm seeing. I don't see people
look at things.
I don't see people on the broad left in the U.S. freaking out like they oughta. So and this is always the story when a democracy slides into illiberalism, right? Is like the liberal elites, the comfortable, moderate liberal elites, keep thinking, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, they won't spread that much. Oh, we're safe at least. You can go back and read about the decade and a half as Hitler was gaining power in Germany before he took power, and you can find quotes from liberal elites that are so eerily like what you're hearing now, right? Like they thought that Hitler was ridiculous and kind of laughable, and no one would fall for that sort of ridiculous rhetoric. And, just every time Hitler ramped it up and took another step, you just see the liberal elites kind of just like, oh, it's not, oh, it'll burn itself out. Oh, it's not that bad, until they're getting rounded up, until they're getting put in camps. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I guess all that stuff was serious. I guess we should have gotten freaked out about 5 to 10 years ago. And that, as far as I can tell, is the exact period we're in the U.S. The period where people ought to be freaking out if they want to stop this before it's too late, and they just aren't.
Well, I can tell it's very jaded, rather negative view of the future of America, but just take it from the opinion of an outsider, an Australian who lives in Europe, who's talking to you now from Mexico. As an outsider to America, and you tell me what you think about this, but I find that the Americans and their domestic politics is dialed to 150% all of the time. And if you take a much more detracted worldview and just look at themes globally, like thematically global themes, the United States is sitting in the best seat, and they have the best outlook ahead of them. And it might be true that domestically your internal politics could be going really askew. Personally, I tune out to it, so I really don't understand. But I do heavily subscribe to the worldview of Peter Zeihan, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with or not, but he wrote a very, very good book last year called Disunited Nations. He's probably certainly one of the world's most qualified and respected geopolitical analysts. And he does the same thing, 10, 20-year outlook, highlighting Turkey, Brazil, China, Russia, Argentina, the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States of America. And ultimately, each country you can dial in to, look at their domestic politics, and find things to be very worried about. On the left saying we need to be way more loud and vocal about this because look at the terrible direction we're headed on. Equally on the right, I'm sure, as you know, there's a lot of political pundits in the United States who will be able to give a very similar argument that you just made, but just the inflection will be different, that the Republicans need to be making more noise for things to happen. And so just basically,